The morning of January 11, 1943, began with fog, not the rolling, cinematic kind that dissolves at sunrise, but a low, stubborn overcast that pressed down on the Bismarck Sea and turned the water the color of old iron. Somewhere inside that gray curtain, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton stood on the bridge of USS Wahoo and stared at a coastline that no American submarine had any business approaching. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that men who served under him would spend decades trying to describe accurately. Not reckless, they always said, never reckless, but willing to go somewhere nobody else had gone and stay there longer than anyone thought possible. The chart spread across the navigation table below showed WWII Inlet on the northeastern coast of New Guinea, Japanese-occupied territory, a harbor the Imperial Japanese Navy used as an anchorage for destroyers, transports, and supply vessels pushing resources south toward Guadalcanal. American forces were grinding through the Guadalcanal campaign at that moment, absorbing casualties at a rate that made Washington uncomfortable. Every ship Japan managed to slip through to reinforce their garrison on that island cost American lives. Morton had spent 3 weeks hunting for an opportunity like this. Wahoo's second war patrol under his command had begun on December 27, 1942, out of Brisbane, Australia. The first patrol in October had been frustrating. A single ship sunk, one torpedo hit mechanical problems, and a commanding officer Morton considered too cautious. That commanding officer had been relieved. Morton took command. Now, Wahoo was parked at the edge of a harbor that the United States Navy's own charts listed as uncharted. The approaches to WWII appeared on American maps as a blank space with a notation that read, essentially, unknown, no soundings, no confirmed channel depth, no information about shoals, reefs, or underwater obstructions. Morton intended to go in anyway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What made this decision remarkable was not just the audacity of it. It was the reasoning behind it. Morton had thought to the logic of what WWII represented and arrived at a conclusion that few submarine commanders in the Pacific were willing to reach. A destroyer in harbor was not a threat. A destroyer hunting you in open water was a threat. A destroyer at anchor, unaware of your presence, was a target. And Morton had come to the Pacific to sink targets. The intelligence that brought Wahoo to WWII had come through ultra-intercepts, the product of American cryptanalysts working against Japanese naval codes. The intercepts indicated that WWII was being used as a staging point for destroyer operations. The specific number of vessels present on any given day varied, but the harbor was active. Ships moved in and out regularly. And at that moment in January 1943, the Japanese considered WWII safe. No American submarine had ever entered those waters. Morton intended to change that. His executive officer was Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, 27 years old, already marked as exceptional by the men who evaluated such things. O'Kane handled the periscope approach work with a precision that Morton relied upon completely. The two men had developed a working relationship that was unusual for the submarine service. In standard doctrine, the commanding officer operated the periscope during an attack, calling out bearings and ranges, directing the fire control party. Morton had moved O'Kane to the scope. He himself worked the plot, cross-checking solutions, thinking ahead to the next firing position, while O'Kane fed him the raw observation data. It was a division of labor that would later influence how the Navy trained submarine officers. In January 1943, it was simply the way Morton and O'Kane chose to fight their boat. The chart problem was solved in a manner that told you something about the command climate aboard Wahoo. Morton gathered his officers and the senior enlisted men who operated the navigation equipment and told them the situation plainly. The approaches to WWII were uncharted. They were going in. The men who understood shallow water navigation and sonar would figure out how to do it safely. He expected solutions, not objections. What they found was a tourist guide, specifically a pre-war Japanese publication that one of Wahoo's officers had acquired somewhere in the process of the submarine service's informal intelligence gathering. The guide described WWII in general terms, mentioned the harbor's existence, and included a small map that was better than nothing. With that map and careful sonar work, Wahoo felt her way toward the entrance. The tension in the control room during that approach defied description from the men who were present for it. Sonar operators called out depth readings continuously. The officer of the deck watched the fathometer. Morton stood at the chart table and made calculations that balanced Wahoo's draft against the reported and assumed depths of the channel. The submarine moved at bare steerage, slow enough that a collision with an underwater obstruction might be survivable, or might not be. They made it through the entrance. What O'Kane saw through the periscope when Wahoo cleared the channel and the harbor opened before him was the kind of sight that submarine commanders spend entire careers hoping to encounter. A destroyer, large and fully armed, riding at anchor in the morning haze. Nearby, a transport, a tanker sitting low in the water, her tanks apparently full. Other vessels in the anchorage, their precise types difficult to determine at range, but present, stationary, unaware. The Japanese destroyer was identified as a Harasame class, approximately 1,800 tons, a modern fleet destroyer with anti-submarine capability, deck guns, and torpedoes. She was also sitting perfectly still with no steam up and no indication that her crew was at any elevated state of readiness. The IJN did not post anti-submarine watches in WWII because American submarines did not come to WWII. Morton brought Wahoo to attack depth and began working toward a firing position. The fire control problem was complicated by the geometry of the anchorage, multiple targets in a confined space, shallow water limiting depth options, and the certainty that the first torpedo explosion would bring every vessel in the harbor to immediate combat readiness. The attack needed to be rapid, efficient, and lethal in the first moments, because there would be no second opportunity for quiet maneuvering. O'Kane called ranges and bearings. The torpedo data computer-generated firing solutions. Morton approved each one and held his position until the geometry was right. The first torpedo ran toward the destroyer. It missed, ran under her. Morton did not stop. He adjusted the depth setting on the next weapon and fired again. The second torpedo struck the destroyer under her forward gun mount. The explosion was violent enough that men in Wahoo's control room heard it through the hull without any instrument to amplify it. The destroyer Harasame, or a vessel of that class, broke her moorings and began to list. Before the debris from that explosion had finished falling, Morton was already redirecting O'Kane toward the transport. 2 more torpedoes. One hit. The transport, a vessel the crew estimated at several thousand tons, took the impact in her midsection and began flooding immediately. The harbor was alive now. Every vessel that had steam available was working to get underway. Crews that had been sleeping, eating breakfast, performing maintenance, were racing to their battle stations. Smoke began rising from the destroyer's wound. Signal flags went up. The radio silence of a peaceful morning anchorage turned into frantic communications traffic. Morton turned Wahoo toward the third target and kept firing. This is what patrol report that Morton submitted upon returning to Brisbane became one of the most studied documents in Pacific submarine history. Not because of what it claimed, but because of what it revealed about the philosophy of attack that Morton had developed and was now executing under live fire conditions. Morton fired until he had targets and torpedoes. He did not husband weapons for later. He did not calculate the minimum number of hits needed and preserve the remainder against future opportunities. He had found the most valuable concentration of enemy shipping he was ever likely to encounter in a single position, and he intended to destroy as much of it as possible before Wahoo was forced to withdraw. Wahoo fired 9 torpedoes in WWII Harbor. The results, as Morton reported them and as post-war analysis partially confirmed, included the destroyer heavily damaged or sunk, the transport struck and sinking, and a third vessel damaged. The exact tonnage and precise number of confirmed kills became a matter of record adjustment after the war, as Japanese records were examined against American patrol reports. But the fundamental achievement was not in question. An American submarine had penetrated an uncharted Japanese harbor, attacked multiple warships at anchor, and escaped. The escape was its own ordeal. The now aroused destroyer escorts, those that had get underway, began searching for Wahoo. The harbor entrance, tight enough coming in, had to be navigated again under pursuit. Depth charges fell. Not close, but close enough. Morton took Wahoo deep, used the channel geometry as cover, and worked his way back out to open water. By the time Wahoo cleared WWII and surfaced in the Bismarck Sea, January 11, 1943, was several hours old. The crew had been at battle stations for most of it. Men who had been awake for 20 hours were now being asked to stay awake longer because Morton was not finished. He had 12 torpedoes remaining. The patrol had weeks left to run. And somewhere north of New Guinea, Japanese convoy traffic was moving supplies toward the front. Morton turned Wahoo north. What followed in the next several days would make the WWII attack look like a preliminary exercise. But to understand what happened next and why it mattered as much as it did, it is necessary to understand what the American submarine force was actually trying to accomplish in January 1943 and how far the reality of that effort had fallen short of its ambitions. The United States had entered the Pacific War with high expectations for its submarine fleet. The doctrine developed in the 1930s held that submarines would form a commerce-destroying force capable of strangling Japan's island economy by cutting the sea lanes that connected the home islands to the raw materials of the southern resource area. Japan imported virtually all of its oil, most of its iron ore, much of its rubber and bauxite. Cut those supply lines, and the industrial machine that supported the imperial military would slowly stop. The theory was sound. The execution in the first year of the war was deeply troubled. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon carried by American submarines in 1942 and into 1943, was malfunctioning at a rate that officers in the field found difficult to believe and that officers at the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington found even more difficult to acknowledge. Torpedoes were running too deep, passing beneath target ships without detonating. Contact exploder mechanisms were failing on direct hits. The magnetic influence exploder, a device designed to trigger detonation beneath a ship's keel where structural damage would be maximized, was producing erratic results across a range of magnetic environments it had never been tested in. Submarine commanders were filing patrol reports that described attacks where multiple torpedoes struck enemy vessels and failed to explode. The ships sailed away. The submarines dived and tried to understand what had gone wrong. The official response from the torpedo development establishment was, for a period measured in months, to question whether the attacks had actually occurred as described. Combat stress, periscope misidentification, inaccurate fire control solutions. The commanders were doubted before the weapons were. Morton had dealt with this. Every submarine commander in the Pacific had dealt with this. You calculated the approach, refined the solution, fired with confidence, watched the torpedo run toward the target, heard or felt nothing, surfaced to find the ship still moving. Then you filed a report and received, eventually, a response suggesting the problem was not the torpedo. By January 1943, the debate was not yet resolved. Investigations were ongoing. Some fixes had been attempted and partially implemented. The full scope of the Mark 14's problems would not be officially acknowledged until later that year, when tests conducted at Pearl Harbor demonstrated conclusively what submarine commanders had been reporting for 18 months. But in the meantime, men like Morton were fighting with weapons they could not entirely trust, against an enemy that was adapting its convoy tactics to reduce its vulnerability. Japanese merchant shipping losses in 1942 had not been negligible, but they had also not been the strategic catastrophe American planners had projected. The Imperial Navy had instituted convoy escort procedures faster than expected. Anti-submarine warfare training had improved. Depth charge patterns had become more sophisticated. The safe assumption that a submarine which dived quickly could survive any counterattack was no longer entirely reliable. Morton understood all of this and attacked anyway. His approach to the torpedo reliability problem was characteristically direct. He fired more torpedoes per attack than doctrine suggested. Where another commander might fire 2 weapons at a target and expect the mathematics of redundancy to compensate for any malfunction, Morton fired 3 or 4. The resulting hit rates, even with malfunctioning weapons in the inventory, were better than fleet averages. Volume compensated for unreliability. And Morton, uniquely, seemed incapable of the conservation instinct that led other commanders to husband torpedoes against future opportunities that might or might not materialize. The future opportunity Morton was now steering Wahoo toward was moving through the waters north of New Guinea at convoy speed. On January 26, 1943, Wahoo's radar detected a large contact. The The convoy that materialized out of the darkness as O'Kane brought the periscope to bear was substantial. The centerpiece was a troop transport, a large vessel loaded with Japanese soldiers. Escorting her were destroyer-type vessels, their positions plotted on the attack solution board in Wahoo's conning tower. The troop transport was later identified as Biomaru, a vessel of approximately 5,500 tons. She was carrying an estimated 835 Japanese soldiers from the 18th Army, reinforcements bound for New Guinea. Alongside the soldiers, she also carried a contingent of Indian prisoners of war who had been captured during earlier Japanese operations in Southeast Asia. Morton brought Wahoo in from the surface in darkness, using the speed advantage a surface submarine held over a submerged convoy. This was Morton's preferred attack geometry for night work. Submarines of the Gato class, like Wahoo, could make 21 knots on the surface. Their maximum submerged speed was approximately 9 knots and could not be sustained for more than a brief period before battery depletion forced the boat to the surface again. A convoy making 10 to 12 knots could be overtaken, positioned ahead of, and attacked from a favorable angle, all while the submarine remained surfaced and invisible in the darkness. Morton fired from the surface at approximately 3,000 yards. The first torpedo struck Biomaru amidships. The explosion was immediate and massive. Secondary explosions followed as something in the transport's cargo or fuel contributed to the initial blast. The vessel began breaking apart. Men went into the water, hundreds of them, soldiers in full kit, struggling in the tropical sea. The two destroyer escorts, initially caught opposition, turned toward Wahoo's last estimated location and began their search patterns. Morton took Wahoo down and let the first counterattack run its course. The depth charges fell wide. When Wahoo surfaced an hour later, the scene that greeted the bridge watch was the one that has attached itself most indelibly to the history of this patrol and to the historical judgment of Dudley Morton. The water around the sinking Biomaru was covered with survivors, soldiers, many of them still armed, some in lifeboats, others on rafts, still others floating on debris. The destroyer escorts were visible in the distance, still searching for the submarine rather than attending to their own survivors. Morton ordered his deck gun crew to their stations. What happened next was documented in Morton's own patrol report, in the recollections of crew members who testified about it afterward, and in the post-war accounts of Japanese survivors. Wahoo's deck gun and her machine guns opened fire on the men in the water. The engagement lasted approximately 30 minutes. When it ended, the number of Japanese soldiers from Biomaru who survived to reach shore was a small fraction of those who had entered the water. The Indian prisoners of war who had also been aboard suffered casualties in the engagement as well, though the exact number could not be determined from the available evidence. Morton justified the action in his patrol report. He noted that men in the water had been armed and had fired on Wahoo. He noted that the soldiers, if rescued by the escorts, would be returned to the front and employed against American and Australian forces in the New Guinea campaign. He described the action in the direct, operational language of patrol report rather than the language of moral justification, which created a document that could be read either as a straightforward recording of a tactical decision or as evidence of something that could not be made clean by operational framing. The Navy did not court-martial Morton. His superiors did not reprimand him. The patrol report was read, filed, and eventually cited in support of the decorations Morton received. The question of whether what happened at the Biomaru site constitute a war crime under the laws of armed conflict, as they existed in 1943, or under the standard applied at the post-war tribunals, where Japan's own conduct was judged, was not formally adjudicated in Morton's case. Historians have examined this episode from every angle available to them. The evidence suggests that some of the men in the water were indeed armed and that fire was directed at Wahoo. It also suggests that the scale and duration of what followed exceeded any plausible claim of self-defense. The Indian prisoners who died had not fired at anyone. The fundamental reality of the engagement is that a United States submarine crew, under orders from their commanding officer, killed men who were in the water after the sinking of their ship. Morton came home from the second patrol of Wahoo to a reception that was, by any external measure, triumphant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific, was waiting at the dock. He had read the patrol reports. The WWII penetration alone would have made the patrol historically significant, combined with the convoy attacks that followed, including Bio-Maru and several additional vessels struck in the waters north of New Guinea. Wahoo's Second War Patrol under Morton represented a standard of aggressive performance that the submarine force had not previously achieved. Lockwood recommended Morton for the Navy Cross and drove a request for the Presidential Unit Citation for Wahoo through the appropriate channels. He also used Morton's methods as a teaching case: the willingness to enter restricted waters, the surface attack at night, the high tempo of fires, the refusal to break off an engagement as long as torpedoes remained and targets were present. These were behaviors Lockwood wanted his submarine commanders to emulate. Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, was already being talked about as a future commanding officer of exceptional potential. His work at the periscope during the WWII attack and the subsequent convoy actions had demonstrated an unusual combination of composure under fire and the speed of observation that attack work required. O'Kane would leave Wahoo before the Fourth War Patrol to take command of USS Tang, a newer boat, Gatto class, with a fresh crew that would need to be trained and shaped in O'Kane's image. Morton, aboard Wahoo, would take the boat on 2 more patrols. The third patrol in March and April of 1943 added 7 more ships to Wahoo's record and deepened the tactical reputation Morton was building. The fourth patrol in the Sea of Japan in August and September that year would begin aggressively and end in silence. Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor on her 4th War Patrol on August 9, 1943. Her orders called for operations in the Sea of Japan, the enclosed body of water between the Japanese home islands and the Korean peninsula. No American submarine had operated there since early in the war, when results had been poor. Getting in required threading through minefields in the Tsugaru Strait or the La Perouse Strait. Getting out required doing it again. Inside the sea, Japanese anti-submarine forces would have limited room to operate in ways that favored submarine evasion. Morton went anyway. Wahoo's transit into the Sea of Japan was completed successfully. In the first 2 weeks of operations inside the sea, Morton attacked multiple vessels. Japanese records from the post-war period credit Wahoo with sinking a number of ships during this period, though the exact tally remains subject to the same reconciliation process that affected all Pacific submarine claims. On October 11, 1943, a Japanese anti-submarine aircraft spotted Wahoo's surface in the La Perouse Strait, presumably attempting to exit the Sea of Japan. The aircraft attacked. Post-war Japanese records documented an oil slick, debris, and disturbance on the surface consistent with a submarine sinking. No distress message was received from Wahoo. No contact of any kind was ever made with her after she entered the Sea of Japan. 79 men were lost. The Navy listed Wahoo as overdue and presumed lost on December 9, 1943. Morton's record at the time of his death stood at 27 ships sunk, a figure subsequently revised through post-war analysis to 19 confirmed sinkings. The number is significant but secondary to what his 2 years of Pacific combat had demonstrated about what an aggressive submarine commander, working with well-trained crew and a willingness to press attacks that doctrine suggested avoiding, could accomplish against Japanese shipping and naval forces. What made Morton's methods permanent was not his personal record. Records can be surpassed. What Morton left behind was a philosophy that the men who served under him carried into their own commands. O'Kane took it to Tang. Other officers who passed through the submarine force during Morton's active period absorbed specific tactical lessons: the night surface attack, the firing approach that placed a submarine inside convoy formations rather than safely outside them, the preference for multiple target engagements over single ship attacks, and translated those lessons into their own combat performance. The cumulative effect on Japanese shipping logistics across the Pacific was measurable. American submarines sank enough Japanese merchant tonnage in 1943 and 1944 to create genuine fuel and supply shortages in the Japanese home islands and at the front. The acceleration of that campaign from the modest results of 1942 to the devastating effectiveness of 1944 and 1945 involved many factors. Better torpedoes, after the Mark XIV's problems were finally acknowledged and corrected. More submarines, as American industrial production hit its stride. Better intelligence, as the cryptanalytic effort matured. But it also involved a generation of submarine commanders who had studied Morton's methods and decided he had been right. The Japanese destroyer losses to American submarines in the final 2 years of the war reduced Japan's capacity to protect its convoys at precisely the moment when convoy protection mattered most. The strangling of the supply routes that Pacific war planners had projected in 1941 did eventually materialize, not in the form originally imagined, but in a form that directly contributed to Japanese military defeats in the Marianas, the Philippines, and ultimately in the strategic calculus that led to Japan's surrender in August 1945. Morton did not live to see any of that. Dudley Morton was born in Owensboro, Kentucky on July 14, 1907. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy with the class of 1930, which was not a distinguished year by the conventional measures the Navy used to track such things. The country was in the early stages of the Depression. The Navy was contracting, not expanding. Officers commissioned in 1930 spent the following decade on ships that were aging, in a service that could not be certain of its strategic relevance, learning their profession in conditions that rewarded patience more than aggression. Morton spent those years in destroyers and submarines, collecting the kind of competence that does not announce itself. His fitness reports describe him as reliable, capable, thorough, not the language of prophecy. The Navy's evaluation system was not designed to identify men who would become dangerous under conditions of total war, because no one was certain what those conditions would require. Pearl Harbor answered that question on December 7, 1941. In the days and weeks that followed the attack, the submarine force in the Pacific received orders that reflected the shock of the moment more than any coherent doctrine. Submarines were directed to attack Japanese shipping. The specific methods were left largely to individual commanders. This produced an immediate and revealing diversity of outcomes, because submarine commanding officers were not a uniform population. Some were aggressive, some were cautious, some were technically precise, some were imaginative. The weapon, the Gato-class submarine with its Mark 14 torpedoes, was theoretically capable of devastating results. What produced in 1942 was frustration. The torpedo problem was real, documented, and denied at the highest levels of the Navy's ordnance establishment for a period that cost the submarine force results it should have achieved in the first 2 years of the war. The Mark 14 ran approximately 11 feet deeper than its set depth. This meant that a torpedo set to run at a depth of 10 feet to strike a destroyer's hull was actually passing under the destroyer at 21 feet and continuing into open water on the far side. The contact exploder, which was supposed to detonate on impact, was also failing. The firing pin was designed to strike the exploder cap with a force that triggered detonation under certain conditions, specifically when the torpedo struck at a near perpendicular angle to the target hull. The firing pin crumpled rather than firing. A direct hit produced a dud. The magnetic influence exploder, which was supposed to detonate the warhead as the weapon passed under the magnetic anomaly created by a ship's steel hull, was malfunctioning in the magnetic environment of the Pacific in ways it had never malfunctioned in the testing grounds off the American coast where it had been developed. Submarine commanders had been instructed to trust this device and not to disable it. They were following those instructions while watching their torpedoes run under targets, strike hulls and fail to explode, and detonate prematurely under the influence of their own magnetic fields when the sea conditions were wrong. The investigation that eventually led to correction of these problems is one of the more frustrating administrative episodes in American military history. Commander Dudley Morton's contribution to forcing that investigation was indirect but real. His patrol reports, which described attacks conducted at short range with carefully computed solutions and documented the specific behaviors of torpedoes that ran under targets or struck without detonating, were part of the accumulating evidence that eventually became impossible to explain away. In September of 1943, Commander James Fife ordered tests at Pearl Harbor. Torpedoes were fired at nets. The running depths were measured. The results confirmed everything the submarine commanders had been reporting for 20 months. The Mark 14 was defective. Corrections were ordered. The magnetic influence exploder was disabled. The depth mechanism was adjusted. The contact exploder was redesigned. By the spring of 1944, American submarines were going to sea with weapons that worked. The effect on Japanese shipping losses was immediate and unmistakable. In the first 6 months of 1944, American submarines sank more Japanese merchant tonnage than they had in all of 1942 and 1943 combined. Mort was already dead by then. He had fought through the worst period of the torpedo crisis with weapons he could not fully trust against an enemy that was adapting and had still produced results that nobody else in the force had matched. The question of what Dudley Mort might have accomplished with functioning torpedoes belongs to the category of historical speculation that is genuinely unanswerable. What is answerable is what he did with the weapons he had. 19 confirmed ship sinkings, 5 war patrols, the WWII penetration, the convoy actions in the waters north of New Guinea, the final, silent disappearance in the La Perouse Strait. The Navy awarded Morton the Navy Cross 4 times. Each award covered a specific patrol action. His posthumous record also included the Presidential Unit Citation for WWII. His name was given to the destroyer USS Morton, which commissioned in 1945 and served until 1991. A Naval Reserve Center in his home state of Kentucky carries his name. The submarine base at Pearl Harbor named a street for him. These are the official markers, the institutional acknowledgments that a service renders to men it considers exemplary. They are not the whole story. The whole story involves the men who watched Morton work and went away changed by it. Richard O'Kane left Wahoo in February of 1943 with 11 months of combat experience under the most aggressive submarine commander in the Pacific. He took command of USS Tang in October that year. Tang's first patrol, in February of 1944, produced 5 confirmed sinkings. Her second patrol added 4 more. By the time Tang was lost in October 1944, O'Kane had accumulated 33 ships sunk across 5 patrols, the highest confirmed total of any American submarine commander in the Pacific War. O'Kane was explicit about what he had learned from Morton: the willingness to close range, the preference for surface attacks at night, the decision to press an engagement rather than break off when the tactical picture became complicated, the instinct that torpedoes sitting in their tubes were worthless, and that the only way to measure a weapon's value was to fire it at something worth sinking. These were not instincts O'Kane was born with. They were methods Morton had demonstrated and O'Kane had absorbed. Samuel Dealey, who commanded USS Harder to the 5 destroyer patrol at Toi Toi and ultimately lost his boat and crew in the waters off Luzon in August of 1944, had studied Morton's approach to aggressive positioning. Dealey's development of the down-the-throat shot as a standard tactical option, rather than a desperate last resort, reflected the same underlying premise that Morton had acted on at WWII. The enemy's attack run was a vulnerability if you had the nerve to treat it that way. Most commanders did not have that nerve. Morton and Dealey both did. Eugene Fluckey, who commanded USS Barb and whose 6th War Patrol in 1945 included a shore bombardment of the Japanese home island Hokkaido by submarine-launched rockets, a feat without precedent in naval history, had internalized a command philosophy that traced directly to the aggressive culture Morton had helped create in the Pacific Submarine Force. Fluckey received the Medal of Honor for his patrol record. His confirmed sinkings place him in the tier immediately below O'Kane. These 3 men, O'Kane, Dealey, and Fluckey, represent the clearest direct line from Morton's methods to the submarine force's most devastating period. But the influence ran wider than individual commanders. The patrol reports Morton filed became training documents. The specific tactical problems Wahoo had solved, the WWII channel approach, the night surface attack geometry, the management of multiple targets in confined space, were studied by officers who were preparing for their own commands. Admiral Lockwood, who understood that the submarine force's effectiveness depended as much on command culture as on equipment, used Morton's record deliberately. When he needed to demonstrate what was possible, he pointed at Wahoo's 2nd War Patrol. When he needed to explain what aggressive attack geometry looked like in practice, he used Morton's firing solutions. When the torpedo crisis finally forced a confrontation with the Bureau of Ordnance, Lockwood used the accumulated evidence from patrol reports like Morton's to make a case that could not be dismissed as isolated misperception. The strategic impact of the American submarine campaign against Japan is sometimes understated in popular accounts of the Pacific War because it operated in a domain that produced no dramatic images. There were no photographs of submarine attacks. There were no film crews in the conning towers. The campaign happened in darkness, underwater, in waters thousands of miles from the nearest neutral observer. Its results accumulated in the form of Japanese shipping statistics and in the shortages that those statistics eventually produced. Japan required approximately 10 million tons of imported materials annually to sustain the industrial production her military required. American submarines sank approximately 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping in 1944 alone. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had stood at approximately 6 million tons at the beginning of the war, was below 3 million tons by the end of 1944. Food shortages appeared in the home islands. Fuel allocation for military operations became constrained. The ability to reinforce and resupply island garrisons that American forces were attacking degraded steadily through the final 2 years of the war. The official United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after Japan's surrender by analysts who had access to Japanese government and military records, concluded that the submarine campaign had been the single most important factor in Japan's economic collapse. Not to be 29 bombing campaigns, which destroyed large portions of Japanese cities, and were far more visible in both execution and consequence. Not the naval battles in the Marianas and the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, which destroyed Japan's ability to project carrier aviation. The submarine campaign, conducted largely in the dark and the silence, against merchant ships and tankers, and transports that never made the front pages of American newspapers. Morton's contribution to that campaign was not in the final accounting, which was largely achieved after his death with better weapons and a generation of commanders he had helped to train. His contribution was in the period when the campaign was failing, when the weapons were broken and the doctrine was timid, and the results were falling short of everything the Navy had promised. Morton went to WWII anyway. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.